I promised that I'd do videos on more than just planes, and I feel like it's about time I did a tank. So naturally, I picked the only tank that embodies both the quotes of "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger" and "beware an old man in a profession where men die young" at the same time. Today we're going to talk about the vaunted vault of violence on tracks that is America's signature main battle tank, the M1 Abrams. America's frontline mobile fortress is currently staring down the barrel of its M1A3 rework that should theoretically be out in the next few years. Supposedly, it's going to include technologies from the Abrams X demonstrator and maybe from a couple of previous prototypes like the Cat B, and the requirements will apparently include things like firing hypersonic missiles out of its gun and reducing its heat and radar signatures. Because America, and the reminder that the chances of you being watched by an Abrams are slim, but never zero. And if you think having systems like this on a tank are wild, that still doesn't hold a candle to the absolute roller coaster that was getting this tank into service in the first place. To start this very long story, we have to rewind all the way to the entry of the Abrams' predecessor, the M60. The M60, which entered service in the early 1960s, was a post-Korean War era M48 Patent 3 tank with a body kit, some new electronics, and eventually a better gun refitted to the same old engine and transmission. And while military vehicles may also have a habit of getting into god-awful movies, the M60 was certainly no vampire, and there was no way on Earth it was going to last forever. And with the US now subscribed to the concept of the main battle tank, i.e. a tank that could carry the firepower of a heavy with the mobility of a medium, a new version of this concept that could outfit the whole US Army would be a nice thing to have, especially if they could have it forever, because the Army decided they wanted this tank to basically be immortal and last the remainder of the 20th century.
Maybe I should get a coffin to sleep in.
So in 1960, right as the M60 was getting its service cherry popped, the US had already started studying what they wanted in a replacement. And the results of that study were really unusual. See, this time period was also the start of the missile era, and a lot of military thinkers were thinking that missiles were going to become the primary weapons of tomorrow, because in theory, you can guide a missile into a target and only have to shoot it once, instead of having to guesstimate your shot placement with shell after shell until the bad guy goes boom. Fewer shots fired on each target means more can tannings to go around. It's just science. And the Army expected they could apply this philosophy to tank combat, and such decided that this next generation tank was going to be a 40-ton vehicle with a new primary weapon, that being the CVWS Shillelagh guided anti-tank missile. But they were also going to fire this missile out of a gun, so the new tank could also use conventional shells for infantry support.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
But this is the military, and we all know nothing ever goes according to plan here, and both plans and politics would change in 1962. Now, if you were around for the absolute saga that was me telling the story of the F-4 Phantom, you would recognize that year as being the same one when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara embarked on his not-so-epic quest to standardize the military to save money. Spoiler warning, it didn't work, but he didn't know that yet, and by April of that year, he would pivot his wannabe Eye of Sauron from the fighter jets to the tanks. And around the same time as the US was looking into replacing its M60s, Germany was also going through the motions of building its own domestic tanks once again. McNamara saw this and probably thought to himself something along the lines of, well, if we can standardize our stuff for ourselves, why not try and standardize our stuff to other countries too? Working together means stronger friendships and military ties. We could spread these standards to all of NATO to keep logistics simple for the alliance, and more countries equals more money, which equals less financial strain on everybody involved. Hooray. The Army, however, wasn't really on board with the whole thing because they just needed a new tank now for themselves, not one for everybody sometime next decade. But the Army wasn't making the decisions here, the politicians were, and so the Army got overruled.
Okay, fine, whatever.
So by late 1963, the US and West Germany had signed the US and FRG Cooperative Tank Development Program with the goal of creating just such a standardized unit, the MBT or KPZ-70, and began communicating their boundaries for what was supposed to become a rather intimate military relationship. However, it turns out that America and Germany aren't exactly known for having good chemistry. You'd think the first 40 years of the century would have been a dead giveaway, but I guess not. Both partners would discover that cooperation between two different countries with different priorities, languages, and most importantly, egos is not nearly as easy as somebody who didn't think about it at all thought it was going to be. There were constant disagreements over technology, like the Germans wanting a 120mm smoothbore gun while America wanted their 6-inch shillelagh missile cannons. There were disagreements on who got to build what parts, and then there was just the general fact that people were trying to combine the metric system and imperial units. That's just doomed to fail, period. And when the Germans finally made up their mind on what they wanted in a tank by the spring of 1969, they would turn around and show the Americans their decision.
That's my best offer. Take it or leave it.
And the results were completely different from what the US was trying to put together. Not only that, it wasn't even completely in line with the requirements that Germany had helped outline and agreed to in the first place. So America was now losing it. They were completely over it with Germany, and the program was just way too complicated and way too expensive. And when I say expensive, I mean they were looking at $1 million per tank in 1970s money, which is like $8.3 million a tank today, which is just absolutely unacceptable, and Germany has clearly given up on being willing to communicate any further, so both sides would break it off completely on January 20th, 1970 and go their separate ways.
I'm out. I'm done.
The US would try to salvage the MBT-70 by making it cheaper and simpler as the XM-803, but Congress put the entire thing in the trash can on December 14th, 1971 and sent the funding for the project to America's newest effort, the XM-815 program, which was later renamed the XM-1 and eventually the Abrams, after Vietnam General Creighton Abrams. And with the MBT-70 program now fully in the dustbin, the US could sit down and study what went wrong and how to turn what they got when they didn't get what they wanted into best practices. So in 1972, the US set the tone for the XM-1 and laid down that it was going to proceed on a maximum of a 6-year development schedule that would have the first unit in service by 1978. And the US would award study contracts to General Motors and Chrysler. The XM-1 would have to be mobile and agile, reload fast, have better weapons than previous tanks, have a better fire control system, be able to shoot on the move, have better armor protection and few if any critical weak spots, be able to fight at night, and be roughly 55 tons in weight or a max of 58 tons. The Army expected a tank recipe that also included more specific ingredients, such as a powertrain that had to last for 4,000 miles without failing as a garnish, a side dish suspension that could handle sustained 25 to 30 mile per hour speeds for cross-country distances, and a main course of a 1,500 horsepower engine and either a 105 or 120 millimeter cannon made to fire shells and not missiles, because the shillelagh turned out to be a sometimes literal hot mess, plus a seasoning of complementary guns of either the 7.62, 50 caliber, or 20 to 30 millimeter flavors. Some German options were considered for all of these, but most were ruled out to avoid foreign reliance.
I don't speak German either.
And here's where things start to get crazy, because each company would be ordered to take a slightly different approach to the program. GM was told to be innovative in their design, while Chrysler was told to be evolutionary. And these design philosophies would come out to play in their prototypes, which were contracted in 1973 and completed in 1975. When the prototypes were delivered to compete against each other in May of 1976, GM had delivered something that definitely resembled the soon-to-be Abrams with a supercharged variable compression diesel engine, the Teledyne Continental Motors or TCM AVCR 1360-1. A variable compression diesel engine actively changes how much it compresses the air in the engine cylinders before igniting it to maintain optimum fuel efficiency at all speeds and torque ranges. It's not a superbly advanced or risky concept, but it's definitely an improvement and clearly more of an innovative solution. Chrysler, however, had taken some recent experimental project experience and made their evolutionary idea a gas turbine-powered tank. Basically, they stuck a jet engine into a tank with a mini fridge stuck to the back end to recuperate some of the energy from the jet exhaust and give a mini pump to the fuel economy. Not like it mattered too much, though, because it was a freaking jet engine. Fuel economy is not what those things are known for. And while they were also more expensive to make, they did come with some benefits, like better reliability and not making a lot of smoke or noise.
Just pick something already!
And they would. After the first round of testing in May of 1976, General Motors would come out on top. But they didn't win the contract. The most common story that gets circulated for what happened next is that a redo of the contest was suddenly ordered at the last minute right before GM should have been given the contract. GM suddenly had to put the gas turbine engine into their prototype and everything had to go back around for a second round of tests. Chrysler would then win the contract in October of 1976, and the popular tinfoil hat theory is that Chrysler was financially struggling, and the US government basically used the whole competition as an excuse to bail them out instead of choosing the more fuel-efficient diesel engine through fair competition. And while Chrysler was financially struggling, and the US has appeared to use that strategy in both the past and recent years, this entire novel is a very clickbaity story that's very good for media headlines, never cited with concrete evidence, and pretty much total bullshit. So grab a chair, put your tinfoil and Leopard 2 Electric Boogaloo shirts back in the drawer because it's time for a history lecture.
Wake up, newbies! Class is in session!
Rewind 2 years. Even though the failed relationship known as the MBT-70 was over, there were still some lingering feelings over standardizing things like engines and ammunition across NATO vehicles. The concept still wasn't a bad idea because then it doesn't matter where in the world a war breaks out, you can still produce ammo and fuel from wherever was closest and ship it to the front line where anyone could use it. So the US and Germany had signed a memorandum of understanding in 1974 that the US would test a tailored variant of Germany's new Leopard 2 tank, this being the Leopard 2 Austere variant, or 2AV, alongside their own prototypes to compete for adoption. And if the US didn't like the German option, then at the very minimum the two tanks could share some nice things. Germany already used a diesel engine in their Leopard 2s and didn't need a different American one that ran on the same fuel, and if the American diesel engine turned out to be bad but better than the gas turbine, there was a chance that the US might turn around and buy Germany's diesel engines instead. But if the gas turbine turned out to be better than the diesel alternatives, Germany would consider adopting the gas turbine from the Americans, which would also be a major victory for American industry. A few other items would also be negotiated, and the agreement selecting which parts would be shared was signed in July of 1976, right before General Motors would have been assigned the contract. Talk about bad timing. So to optimize whatever tank they picked for this possible tech-sharing agreement with the Germans, the Army withdrew the contract award and instead mandated that both tanks be capable of fitting either the gas turbine or the diesel, so they could mount whichever one was best.
You were about to take a bite out of a Popeye's biscuit and I ripped that shit out of your mouth.
Bah, that means they were incentivized to pick the gas turbine engine to fit foreign politics instead of picking the best engine available. Not quite. Did they have an extra incentive to pick the more evolutionary gas turbine engine? Yeah, they did. Was the diesel the better engine? No. Diesel engines do rely on a thermodynamic burn cycle that generally gives them way better fuel economy than gas turbines, but it's rather bold of you to assume that all diesel engines are created equal. A diesel engine isn't necessarily more efficient by comparison to something else by just being a diesel engine, especially if you have to scale it up to some obscene amount, such as, I don't know, twice as much as the last attempt. The last diesel engine America stuck in a tank was the Continental AVDS 17902C 12-cylinder diesel engine as part of the RISE upgrade kit for the M60A1s in 1972. Aside from the alternator, this engine was virtually the same as the 1972A they had put in the original M60 that came out in the 1960s, and only put out 750 horsepower along with twin turbochargers. The turbochargers were needed to increase the engine power by funneling the exhaust gases through a pair of air compressors, which would force more air into the engine cylinders for a better burn and higher power output. However, turbochargers require the exhaust gases to spin up the compressor first so the charging actually engages, which creates a lag time between requesting more power from the engine and getting more power from the turbo. And when you're in a fight, you need acceleration yesterday, not power up by dial-up, so the Army's acceleration requirement meant that whatever engine got accepted needed that power the moment you touched the throttle.
I feel the need for speed.
So instead, TCM designed the AVCR 1361 diesel engine with a supercharger, which takes power directly from the crankshaft, you know, the part that the pistons spin to go from right here to over there, and spins the compressors that way. But running the engine while taking power from the crankshaft means you need more power going to the crankshaft, which means taking a bite out of that theoretical fuel economy you should get from a diesel engine on top of straight up doubling the amount of power coming from it by default from 750 to 1500 horsepower, therefore also roughly doubling the amount of fuel you're going to have to burn. In the first truly new domestic diesel engine America has tried to stick in a tank in nearly a decade, and that resulted in said diesel engine having right around the same fuel economy as the gas turbine, while also being a general piece of shit to work with. The engine also had a lot of reliability issues and suffered multiple major malfunctions during the first round of testing that it won, one of which included ingesting parts of the supercharger into the engine. I may not be a car pro, but I'm pretty confident in the idea that internal combustion engines aren't supposed to cannibalize themselves. The variable compression technology the engine used was also mildly immature at best, and it wasn't developed enough to handle the absolutely ungodly strain of moving a supercharged 1500 horsepower, especially if a torque surge were to happen. Granted, there wasn't a whole lot that GM could do about that, but that didn't mean they couldn't fix their tank. GM's prototype had won the first round of testing, but it was inferior to the Chrysler model in the areas of speed and general fighting ability. The gas turbine engine was literally pulling its weight there, except they didn't. In the few months between the reassignment of their contract and the next round of tests, all GM did was rework the engine bay, otherwise it was the same tank.
Corporate needs you to find the differences between this picture and this picture.
Meanwhile, the Chrysler team was fixing all of their issues. You gotta remember, these guys are about to go belly up, and if they don't win the contract, they don't exist anymore. So they're going for broke, and they don't just fix the engine bay for the diesel engine, they also tackled their deficiencies. They fixed up the armor layout and chiseled out the chin that was the rounded mantlet the Army had hated to solve their issues with armor protection. And then they threw the tank on a diet plan and trimmed off all the bells and whistles to reduce cost. That new month, new you program got the Chrysler prototype down to the point that even with the more expensive gas turbine engine, their prototype was now cheaper than that of General Motors. And so when these tanks went head-to-head in testing, Chrysler took the contest by storm and was deemed the better of the two American solutions in October of 1976. Actually, one of the things the Army noticed was that the gas turbine made a lot less noise and a lot less smoke than the diesel engine, earning the Chrysler prototype the nickname Whistling Death and the GM prototype the nickname Old Smoky. The Army as a general whole was also happy with the result, and in a piece of correspondence between officers, the U.S. Army Combined Arms Combat Developments Activity stated, quote, "Even though there were many of us that could have been comfortable with a diesel engine, not a single person could find a valid reason for rejecting the turbine." Notice how that read that they could not find a single reason for rejecting the turbine, and not that they were pleased with the turbine. The Army was actively looking for reasons to not take the gas turbine and still couldn't find one. Not that they just liked it just because. One of those is a lot more airtight of a reason when you're scrutinizing for corruption. And then just to double tap and make absolutely sure the Army wasn't full of it, the Secretary of the Army would then grill everybody involved in the process for 4 days straight before accepting their decision as his own. Nobody was taking any chances anywhere in this process.
A gentleman's agreement.
Huzzah!
However, the gas turbine wasn't out of the woods yet because Continental would take a page right out of Boeing's book and throw a fit at losing the contest. They would promptly turn around and start lobbying Congress to try and get their engine back in the tanks, which resulted in Congress trying to float a proposal to the Army about developing a backup diesel engine. Luckily, the Army smelled that garbage from a mile away and stuffed the proposal in the dumpster without much issue. Then it was the XM1's turn, because now it had to beat the German tank, whose prototypes had finally made it off the production line and over to the US. This testing would start somewhere around late August, early September, and continue into December of '76. And at the end of that showdown, the XM1 would again emerge victorious. Despite only having a 105mm cannon and a lesser fire control system, the XM1 had better all-around protection, survivability, and better gun rotation and elevation, along with more ideal human factors and ammo stowage options. For example, the XM1 had the majority of its ammunition in the turret and an armored ready rack, but the German version had only 12 rounds accessible in the turret and the other 28 in a diesel-filled slotted fuel rack next to the driver, which the loader would then need to bend down and get to continue launching the anti-whatever delete keys. The 2AV's turret also lacked all-around composite side armor, which would put it at a major disadvantage against shape-charged weapons like RPGs, which basically fire a hypersonic spear of molten metal to basically punch through a tank with the temperature of the sun. Then there was the fact that the Germans just straight up gave the US bad info on how heavy their tank was.
I don't misinform, I just lie.
The 2AV weighed in during testing at slightly over the US weight limit of 58 tons at 59.5 tons. But they didn't actually have the composite armor on the test vehicle, just some armor replacements that would ballast the tank to near the appropriate weight. The US was willing to waive the slightly higher tank mass, but when they found out that in reality the composite armor shifted the tank up to a weight of 63 tons, the Army was pissed. And it's not like the Germans didn't know how heavy it was was going to be. I mean, the armor was already being prepared for a tank that was about to enter service. But by far the biggest factor was cost. For all you Leopard 2 fans out there who think that Leopard should grow on trees, you gotta remember that the United States is about 28 times the size of Germany's landmass and fields items on a much larger domestic scale as a result. The US needs way more vehicles than Germany does, so cost is a lot more of a factor. It's the same reason the US doesn't have well and widely developed public transportation or futuristic infrastructure. Sea to shining sea, And the Leopard 2 would have cost 25% more to manufacture. To put that into perspective of the end result, somewhere in the ballpark of 3,600, maybe a very generous 4,000 Leopard 2s have ever been built to date. On the other side of the pond, over 8,800 Abrams tanks have been built, with some sources quoting upwards of 10,000. Add the cost issues, the weight issues, and the other limitations to the production schedule, likely being 26 months late, after the Germans wanted to skip the testing and development phase to just rush their proven product into service, plus them trying to avoid any fair ends of the technology trade bargain, and the entire project just sounded like it was gonna German engineer itself into a rock and a hard place, and the US would be the only one stuck in a losing spot.
I'm gonna go with no.
And the US isn't in this game to lose. Uncle Sam buys technology to win wars, not political maneuvers, and they're not about to be misled into changing that by half a country that's clearly forgetting which side of the war they're on. So America told the west side of the Berlin Wall to go pound sand and stuck to the XM1. Germany would try to fight it, saying that the Leopard 2 AV won by meeting more individual criteria and that the testing was biased against them because the individual criteria were later reorganized into broader categories. Broader categories like the ones that were actually used to evaluate the American prototypes for the XM1. It's almost like, I don't know, the US understood that individual numbers on a spreadsheet don't win wars, and they decided to instead evaluate their vehicles from the more broad perspectives of general purpose combat, which were then measured as categories that could be prioritized based on what conflicts the US expected to fight in and where, like all-round protection and survivability for more chaotic combat environments and low cost for greater production volumes. Hell, Germany had asked the army to reduce the firing angles their tank got shot from during the testing to try and make their tank look better. I don't think anyone told Germany that if you find yourself in a hole with a shovel, the first thing you should do is stop digging. But they would keep chasing that ticket until the army finally brought up the fact that Germany had lied about their tank submission's weight in a congressional hearing, and several subcommittees would verify the integrity of the American testing plan and floor Germany's bias claims. Magically, Germany quit their bitching about their loss in the American tank contest, probably because they knew that they'd done goofed when the army willingly brings up problems with their programs to Congress. And if that crap has anything to do with you, two different sides are about to agree on something and your ass is about to be glassed because we suddenly got a lot closer to hitting you with the Japanese suntan treatment.
We attacked 3 boats. They dropped the sun on us twice.
I'm starting to think that Germany never got over being 0-2 in the World War scoreboard, because even 30 years later they were still trying to put one over on us and failing just as badly as they did the first 2 times. And honestly, the fact that Americans still believe German propaganda in the 2020s is absolutely wild. But regardless, the XM1 was definitely the best tank for the US, and while the Leo feels like it eats Abrams for breakfast in War Thunder, this is real life, and the Abrams has proven to be a fantastic tank in the years since. The gas turbine engine would still see some issues teethed out through the late 1970s and in its early service years, but by 1980 the first production version of the Abrams was ready for service, the M1. Now we can talk about the tank. This 4-seat absolute brick house is both America's first vehicle made with composite armor and the freedom definition of a low-profile tank. The US would manufacture 3,273 of these between 1980 and January of 1985, and each one would feature an M68 as its main gun, an American license-built copy of the British L7 105mm rifled cannon with a maximum range of 1.9 miles or 3 metric knot miles. This thing could fire a bunch of different rounds, which included things like anti-tank armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding Sabo or APF SDS rounds. Sabos are basically sub-caliber darts that use a large casing to fit the width of the barrel but discard that shell when fired to form a much smaller dart. This creates less air resistance when it flies and keeps as much kinetic energy as possible for punching through armor. Alternatively, it could fire high-explosive anti-tank or heat rounds, which are labeled as anti-tank but are generally used as an anti-everything shell. Explosives are explosives. If it can wreck a building, it can wreck a person. Simple as that.
If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball.
There were a bunch of other shell types on top of that, and it could carry up to 55 rounds, most of them in the turret's ready rack, and the remaining 10 of which would live in the hull. 2 of these 3 racks were made with blowout panels, which are giant slabs of metal designed to fly open if the ammo rack gets fireball cast on it, and the main cabin protecting internal blast door isn't penetrated. That way, if the ammo does cook off, it vents the explosion out the top of the tank and protects the crew from getting turned into Hiroshima wall paintings. But sometimes the gunners will still get hurt by way of the occasional black eye because the brakes are apparently pretty sensitive, and for an originally 55-ton behemoth, the Abrams can go pretty fast. The Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine engine generates, as it was supposed to, 1500 shaft horsepower and can push this mass of Chobom composite armor, caffeine, and spite up to 45 miles an hour when the speed governor is in use and get it from 0 to 20 in 6 seconds. And I say when the speed governor is in use because apparently Army tankers like to pretend that tanks can be hot rods too and turn it off for fun, which is just the most US Army thing I've ever heard.
Speed. I am speed.
It also comes with smoke grenade launchers, which contain special chemicals that block thermal sights on top of line of sight, so an enemy tanker can't just swap sight modes like frickin' Superman. These are different based on the user, with 6 shots on the Army and export versions and 8 on the later Marine Corps versions, at least once they actually got them, and until 2020 when the Marines started handing them off to the Army to pool resources for new toys. I can practically hear America's enemies sighing with relief that the Marines no longer have tanks because I don't know which one's more terrifying either. It can also pop smoke from the engine, but it needs to be using diesel fuel for that because, spoiler warning, the Abrams isn't a picky drinker. She'll guzzle what you give her, whether it be diesel, gasoline, or frickin' jet fuel. Hell, you could probably give her booze if you wanted, but that's probably not recommended and probably a waste of good booze. Also, I don't want to find out what a drunk Abrams does on a Saturday night. And she will drink up to 500 gallons of fuel over a 250 to 300 mile range in ideal conditions. And that ride's gonna be so smooth you can shoot off of it. Thanks to the 7 road wheels on each side with torsion bar suspensions and full tracks that can apparently devolve into half tracks if you lose a front wheel to a mine, this tank can go for some smooth sailing across the terra firma ocean. The 2-plane electro-optical stabilizer also means your gun doesn't give a damn if you rock the boat or not, because it and its thermal sights are gonna nail you to the atmosphere if they see you day or night. And if you shoot back and that shot comes from within 30 degrees of the front, well then I hope you know how to aim, because if you don't, then you're about to realize that you have secretly been an old horse this entire time, because your everything's about to get turned into glue. But these capabilities were just the start of the Abrams career, and it would get upgrades for its upgrades as time passed. There's a lot of them, so we're gonna try and just speedrun this. The M1 tank was kind of a stopgap for the tank's full potential, and while America was getting ready to test the Abrams prototype, they were already analyzing how to make it better over the next couple of decades. This thing may have been supposed to last the rest of the century, but that doesn't mean it had to stay the same the entire time.
I'm going to need a new gun.
So in 1976, the Army opened up the M1E1 program, E meaning experimental, and began fully exploring the growth potential of the Abrams starting in February 1979. These upgrades would manifest in 14 test models weighing 62 tons each, and to get things in sooner, they would commission another stopgap model called the Improved Performance M1, or IPM1, in 1984. This one had the slightly lengthened and up-armored turret that was going on the soon-to-be M1A1 and swapped the 4-piece roof blowout panels for a 3-piece model. The upgrades dropped the top speed to 41.5 miles an hour, and 895 of them would be made before the M1A1 was revealed in 1985. Production would run until 1992, making 4,796 tanks for the Army and the Marines, 59 for Australia, and 755 co-produced in Egypt for their own military. And this variant would get the 120mm.
Give that bitch a cannon. Bitches love cannons.
The M256 cannon was a license-built version of the German Rheinmetall L44 120mm smoothbore gun, and it was pretty much the only thing of value to come from the 1976 tech-sharing agreement with Germany. And they adopted it not because it was immediately better than the 105, the armor-piercing capabilities of that round wouldn't actually happen until the late 1980s, but because the 120mm had more growth potential than the 105. And considering this tank was supposed to be relevant for a minimum of 20 years, growth potential would show up sooner or later. And by this point, there was finally finally almost enough usable potential, and the 105 had gotten outdated enough to convince the US to finally adopt the 120mm gun, which the turret had been designed for and thus needed no expensive modifications. This did reduce the max ammo from 55 to about 40 rounds, but that came with the benefit of eliminating the forward ammo compartment. The turret now had twin blowout panels instead of triplets, and a rear bustle rack to carry the tanker's gear, like shovels, tracks, spare road wheels, or even a plastic lawn chair, probably occupied by Florida Man. It also finally got a fully pressurized internal climate system for nuclear, biological, and chemical defense. You know, filtering out external crap so people can't war crime your tank to death. The A1 Abrams would then be slated for even more points in the talent tree after that, like the M1A1HA or heavy armor variants that came out in 1987, which finally got the depleted uranium armor panels in the turret as spall liners. These materials come in handy when an armor-piercing round either pierces or almost pierces the tank's armor, which would normally fracture said armor into shrapnel and turn the crew into spaghetti called spalling. Spall liners minimize or prevent that spall entirely because we like our crew members either alive or at the very least easy to clean up. Nobody wants to look at a dead body for longer than they have to, let alone scrape it off the walls.
Can we save her?
Like, in Tupperware containers? Because I didn't bring any.
Thankfully, the US wouldn't end up being all that worried about that, not even when they took them into combat in Desert Storm. When Desert Storm started, most units entering the scene had older IPM-1s and M1A1s, but most of them got replaced at the last minute by M1A1HAs with the uranium armor. 3,113 Abrams were sent to the Persian Gulf area, and 2,024 of these tanks were actually sent into combat made up of 120 M1s and 1,904 M1A1s. And that's compared to what were rough estimates of around or at least 5,000 Iraqi tanks. And compared to what they were expecting, these Abrams and the Bradleys they went in with turned these guys into a footprint. The US destroyed an estimated 3,300 tanks during Desert Storm. Most of them were done by Bradleys, not Abrams, but the Abrams was far from useless the entire time. The Army's Abrams force was credited with a lot of highly accurate gunnery, which was attributed to better gun sights and crew training than the enemy, and tank readiness rates of 90% or higher the entire time. Tell me you were ready to kick ass without telling me you were ready to kick ass.
Now, hit me with your best shot!
The Abrams force as a whole wouldn't go unscathed throughout the conflict, but the enemy was kind of a non-factor for the worst of it. I mean, there were reports of enemy shells hitting the Abrams and doing zilch for damage. They basically didn't matter. 14 Abrams tanks would be damaged in the fighting, and while 9 other Abrams were destroyed, none of these 9 were due to enemy action. 2 were caused by the crew scuttling the tanks after the enemy knocked out the tracks in the middle of a hot zone and forced the crew to evacuate, but it turns out the Abrams' biggest enemy is itself, because the other 7 losses were due to friendly fire. The Abrams was so good at putting turrets on the moon that their rounds would outrange the ability of the gunners to identify their targets, and the 120 cannon actually outranged the gun sights themselves. But what's honestly even more impressive is that out of all of these incidents, not a single Abrams crew member was killed.
No casualties, sir.
But that's not to say the Abrams didn't have problems. For example, it absolutely got the reputation of being an 8-hour tank, because it had to stop and refuel roughly every 8 to 12 hours, which was typically only made worse by multiple instances of faulty fuel pumps. They also had to clean the air filters constantly, and if they weren't cleaned for too long, the engine could ingest the sand and hurt itself in its confusion. Even if they weren't vacuuming the local climate, clogged filters would still choke the airflow to the engine and reduce engine power, so people spent a lot of time cleaning them. Crews also noticed that the radios were sometimes ineffective and they needed better navigation systems, and both the 105 and the 120 also apparently had a bunch of firing issues where the breech would get stuck after firing certain volumes of some of the round types. The Abrams is apparently also a case study of why being too good can also be a problem. The M88A1 armored recovery vehicles couldn't tow the Abrams anywhere even if it wanted to, and the M109 Paladin and most M113 variants couldn't keep up with the Abrams and Bradleys during the full tilt charge across the desert sands. But the force was also really lucky the ground invasion had ended at the 100-hour mark, because by the time it was over, the Abrams and Bradleys had run through about 60% of their spare inventory of parts.
I needed that!
And all while this is going on, the Americans had better tanks being made and waiting for their turn, because the M1A2 had been out by 1986. Apparently they didn't enter the war because they were reaching initial operating capability and teething out all their issues, so the military had prioritized the tanks they knew and knew how to fix if something broke. But the M1A2 took the M1A1 and added some additional nice things, like full digital electronic architecture, an independent digital sight for the commander, and a remotely operated weapon system, or ROSE, that the commander could use to take your head off without you even seeing his head. It's like blueballing the enemy, but in urban warfare. Imagine you're just some bad guy on a roof with an AK seeing an Abrams stop, and you're waiting there for the commander to pop his head out of the turret so you can dome him, and all you see instead is that machine gun swiveling around until it looks straight at you, you see a flash, and you wake up in a meet and greet with God while the commander now has a nice pretty screenshot of where you died to put in his debrief.
Say cheese.
However, the US would only get 77 of these, with the majority built for export, 315 for Saudi Arabia and 218 for Egypt. And the last of those came off the production line in 1996, not because the US didn't want more, but because Chrysler Defense closed their doors in 1995 and their factories went with them. So from then on out, the entire Abrams fleet pretty much got stuck on a diet of upgrade packages only. But they would get so many upgrade packages that the timelines will just not fix themselves, so we're just gonna throw the order out the window. I'm pretty sure the only really concrete defined one of these upgrades to come out was the Abrams Integrated Management, or AIM standard, which was basically a factory reset button on the tank's age. America's M1A1s were sent back to the factory standard, completely overhauled and given a gunner's thermal sight if they didn't have it, then put back into service as effectively brand new tanks, basically getting as much mileage out of each chassis as they could. After this point, the information landscape gets kind of foggy. Some of the upgrades appear model specific, but say they had capabilities that you could have sworn were there earlier, or there's conflicting info on which model of the Abrams they're for. So I'm just gonna rattle off the upgrade names and then glob together all the capabilities they have now.
And go.
The most commonly known upgrades are the System Enhancement Packages, or SEPs, of which there are 4. The V1, V2, V3, and the V4, which was cancelled in 2023 because the Abrams needs another diet plan if we don't want it to be another episode of My 80-Ton Life. Tank engineers discovered during the Cold War that 70 tons is kind of the practical limit of any tank build ever. Past that point, you can't make a drivetrain and suspension that'll last any reasonable amount of time, and your bridges and infrastructure will start crumbling at the mere sight of the monstrosity you've created. And the SEP V3 had already put the Abrams at a max of 78 tons. So the V4 went out the window and generated the process of making the current plans for the M1E3. But that wasn't the end of it. A lot of the older Abrams, like the M1s and M1A1s, would also get a bunch of other upgrade kits over time. There was the Heavy Common, or HC variant, made to be standard across the Army and Marines. The limited digital upgrade to some of those, called the D. There was the Firepower Enhancement Package, or FEP, given to the Marine Corps Abrams while they still had them. Then there was the SAED package attached to the M1A1s that basically gave them everything up to the M1A2 SEP V2 upgrades and the urban warfare specific Tusk packages. There were even a bunch of older tanks upgraded to the newer standards, like about 1,000 M1 IPs that got refitted to the M1A2 standard in the mid-2000s. Hell, there was even the Iraq specific M variant. Yeah, Iraq bought 140 Abrams tanks in March 2009 for $860 million. I'm assuming because they needed to replace all the ones we'd blown up. This is like when you get your ass beat in a video game so bad that you send the other team a friend request and ask them to teach you what their build is, because if anybody in the world knows what the Abrams can do, it's Iraq.
Jesus Christ! I was like watching lively footage.
31 stripped-down M1A1 AIMs and SAs were also donated to Ukraine. Bahrain would order some of their own in March of 2024, and Poland would start taking deliveries of their A2V3s this past January. And while many of the export Abrams in places like the Middle East and Ukraine wouldn't do as well in combat as America's models, mostly because they were either downgraded units or they weren't being fielded by American tankers with American training standards, or both, every last one of those tanks was still benefiting from decades worth of development. We're talking full color maps and displays, an extra casing for the uranium armor, second generation thermals for the gunner and commander, a thermal management system so it doesn't look like an open bonfire on a thermal scope, and an internal auxiliary power unit so troops can power the electronics with the engine off if they feel like hitting the old Sneak 100. The Marines even tried out a Dazzler system for thermal guided missiles like the eyes on the T-90, but we don't even use it anymore because there are so many new and different targeting systems that it's just dead weight and better off not on the tank. Then there's the open systems architecture, compatibility with new Army battle command networks, better computing power, and that's just the stuff you can't see. On the outside, you've got things like explosive reactive armor or ERA blocks that are made to detonate like a claymore when a shape charge hits it to disperse the sun metal spear before it can penetrate the tank. Then there's the Israeli Trophy Active Protection System or APS. This massive 5,000-pound brick of a system uses all-round radar sensors to detect incoming anti-tank missiles, RPGs, recoilless rifles, and pretty much anything slower than a bullet, and it will shoot it with a mini grenade to blow it up before it hits the tank. Because naturally the counter to a gun is to shoot the bullet with another gun. And frankly, I'm surprised America wasn't one of the first people to come up with that. On the topic of guns, the Abrams also picked up the Common Remotely Operated Weapons System, or CROWS, which lets your remote turret mount all kinds of machine guns. It could be the M250 cal, the M240 firing 7.62, the M249 SAW chambered in 5.56, the Mark 19 throwing 40mm grenades, and as of July of this year, the Abrams has even tried equipping a minigun into that slot. You know, just in case some random drone swarm forgot that America's policy for destruction is accuracy by volume. We have a bullet with your name on it, we just need to find out which one.
This ammo doesn't belong to you. I'd be more than happy to give the Department of Justice their bullets back.
And speaking of bullets, the Abrams fires some pretty big ones from its 120mm cannon, arguably the most famous of which is its M829A4 APF SDS rounds, aka the Silver Bullets. These are depleted uranium darts that basically amount to self-sharpening, armor-melting middle fingers that'll pierce through your tank, you, the other side, and the hill behind you. Then there's the M830 heat rounds, which are those technically anti-tank but actually anti-everything shaped charged explosive rounds that ruin your day regardless of what you use to inconvenience the Abrams line of sight, whether it was a light tank, a building, or just your general position. These were later replaced by the M830A1 multi-purpose anti-tank or MPAT rounds, which are just heat rounds with a programmable fuse that you can throw at tanks, helicopters, that poor son of a bitch who thought that hiding behind a brick wall would save him. Or if you just want a particular direction removed, you can load up the M1028 canister or can round. If America is a logistics company that specializes in defense, then the Abrams is clearly the distributor, because it literally stocks cans of whoop-ass that are anti-infantry shells with 1,150 tungsten balls in them, because the trench sweeper needed a reboot. Although it's basically the air sweeper at this point, because this shell is right next to the minigun in the official Army response to drone swarms. This is a whole new level of firepower, okay? 1,150 ball bearings and 3,000 rounds a minute, that's not accuracy by volume, that's accuracy by saturation. Uncle Sam has just taken the phrase wall of lead seriously, because drones can't fly if there's no air to fly through. If there are too many things to put up against the wall, America's just gonna pick up the entire wall and chokeslam the quadrant.
You're up against the wall, and I am the f***ing wall.
And speaking of walls, don't bother giving the Abrams any, because it's got a round for that too, the M908 obstacle reducing, or the OR round. Because I can either have a building in my way or a clear path forward, and I know which one I'm gonna pick. Now, this is basically just a heat round with an armor-piercing bottle cap meant to take out buildings and bunkers with extreme prejudice. But here's the thing. The Webster Dictionary definition for obstacle is something that impedes progress or achievement. So technically speaking, some guy pointing an RPG at you is also an obstacle, and I'm telling you right now, if the gunner's got this thing loaded, that guy's about to be reduced to a pan of spaghetti sauce. Actually, I take that back, because if you get hit with one of these things, it's not gonna reduce you, it's gonna delete your section of code from the Matrix. Your existence isn't gonna be revoked, it'll be unwritten. This is Uncle Sam's task manager, because this is the button he presses when he sees your fortified positions running in the background of his battlefield and decides to end your task forever. But that's a lot of different rounds, so as of December of 2024, America has begun replacing the heat, the MPAT, the can, and the OR rounds with the M1147 Advanced Multipurpose or AMP rounds. This is a programmable round that has been in testing and development for almost 20 years now that a tanker can set to detonate on airburst impact or after penetrating some amount of structure. And all of this is just what the Abrams can do so far. There's more coming, we just haven't seen it yet. So in summation, a lot of people tend to claim that the Abrams is the best tank in the world, despite the fact that it is not the best on paper. But that claim isn't due to its stats. It's due to the fact that the Abrams has a history of taking things that insist on being obstacles and reducing them to being fucking irrelevant, regardless of whether those obstacles are paper pushers or bullet pushers. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.